Okay, so welcome everyone to the Buddhist Path of Awakening course. And as we work our way through Volume 1 of the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma, tonight Philip and John are going to be teaching 2 chapters. And I want to say a few words about these teachings just before Philip and John launch into the bulk of the evening. These are about the early teachings of the Buddha. The Buddha lived around 560 to 480 BC, are the usual dates given to him. So that's 560. What is that? Almost 3,000 years ago. 2,400, yeah, 3,000 years ago that he lived. And nobody knows for sure how long he lived. Probably about 60 to 80 years. There was no, or very little, written record in those days. Certainly the printing press had not been invented yet. That came centuries, many centuries later in China. And even written words, it just wasn't done much. So there wasn't much written record, and it took a lot of effort. And actually, it was a act of piety among Buddhist monks later to write by hand, copy the sutras so that people could have copies of the sutras. And the Buddha achieved enlightenment at a young age. He had come from a privileged family. He was of the warrior caste. There were 4 main castes in India. These are social sort of divisions. And the highest caste was that of the Brahmins. They were the religious caste, and then beneath them was the warrior caste, of which were the rulers of often, and the people who had the armies. And the Buddha was of that caste. And below that were the merchants, the merchant caste, and below that were the untouchables, the outcasts, as it were. So the Buddha came from one of the 2 higher castes, and he had led a privileged life. And then he went off. He decided that he needed to understand why there was suffering and death and the unhappiness of life, old age. And so he left his privileged home in the castle and went out in search of enlightenment, basically, to pursue the religious path for years, and finally achieved it. And when he did, he entered the Bodhi tree, which is now, you can find this, go see the descendant of the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya in India. And when he did, he felt for a while that he couldn't communicate what he had understood, what his enlightenment meant. And he traveled and sort of wandered in northern India for about 40 days, kind of 40 days and 40 nights. And then he came across 3 or 4 mendicants with whom he had practiced austerities before, and they saw that something was different about him. And they asked him to explain and to give teachings. And so he gave the first teachings, and they were the teachings of the 4 Noble Truths, which are that life is suffering, that there is suffering in life, that there is an origin or a cause for this suffering, that there can be an end to this suffering, that's the 3rd Noble Truth, and that there is a path leading to the end of suffering. Those are the 4: suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path. The second most important teaching that he gave that at a place called the Jeta Grove outside of what is now modern Varanasi. And you can go there too. And there's a big stupa, huge stupa, several hundred feet high. That's a big monument that was erected to the Buddha who gave his teachings there. But the second teaching that he gave was the teaching of the 3 marks of existence. And these marks are that for confused beings, the marks are suffering, impermanence, and what's the 3rd mark? Very
Egolessness.
egolessness. Thank you. That the ego, what we consider to be an I, does not exist. So the three marks of existence, suffering, these are for confused, unenlightened beings, are suffering, impermanence, everything is impermanent, and egolessness. And actually, these are for unenlightened people, but also for enlightened people. These three marks apply. Tonight, John and Philip are going to be discussing these three marks in the context of these two chapters. So I just wanted to give that little preamble for those of you who are new to Buddhism, and away we go. I think, Philip, you're first, right?
Right. So
Okay.
thank you. That's a great introduction. So tonight we return to the five paths. The first two, the path of accumulation and the path of unification, make up the Hinayana. The path of accumulation is divided into three parts: the lesser path, the middle path, and the greater path. I'll begin tonight's class discussing the first part, the lesser path of accumulation. John Tyler will continue with the middle path. Next week's class will cover the greater path of accumulation and finally the path of unification, which will bring us all the way through the Hinayana to the threshold of the Mahayana, the path of seeing the very joyful Bhumi. So this chapter 63, the lesser path of accumulation, this first chapter can be confusing unless we adjust our point of view. There's a real shift in tone here from the gradual, sequential, intellectual understanding we've gotten used to in the 500 pages or so that we've covered in this text so far. This chapter reads more like an experience, viscerally felt. Chogyam Trungpa will refer to this generally as the contemplative point of view, in a nod to the difference between the experiential practice lineages and the intellectual practice lineages. This point of view specifically is that of a naive beginner. It's almost as if we, as readers, as students, have backed up to the very beginning and are entering the lesser path of accumulation for the first time, without any real intellectual understanding of the Dharma. This chapter reads like an effort to illustrate that experience. This is the easiest way to understand this chapter. This chapter can get a little grim. Let's jump in. So this is the epigraph that Judy Leaf has chosen. It's almost like a trigger warning. As a student who has no idea of Dharma and no mind training, you decide to commit to the path and to train yourself. As you train your mind, you begin to see all kinds of things. What you see is not so much the inspiration of a glimpse of enlightenment or Buddha nature. Instead, the first thing you see is what is wrong with samsara. Rinpoche says, on the lesser path of accumulation, we are predominantly working with the four foundations of mindfulness, namely mindfulness of body, mindfulness of life, mindfulness of effort, and mindfulness of mind, and shamatha vipassana practice. Meditation practice at this level is a way of developing greater mental and psychological sharpness so that dharmas could be perceived properly. We are becoming aware of our psychological hangups and confusions and discovering all kinds of insights into the teachings. We are becoming like clean glass, like well-polished mirrors. And the first thing we see is all that is wrong with samsara. He says, there is a need for faith or devotion to begin with. The faith is blind because we are uncertain as to what we're going to get into, and it is intelligent because we know what we are getting out of. Faith and renunciation go together, for although we want to get out of samsaric imprisonment, we have no idea of the world outside. Faith in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha inspires us to take refuge. We have to turn to somebody who has much greater scope and wisdom. Rinpoche talks about the three ways of learning: hearing, contemplating, and meditating. On the path of accumulation, we have to go through all of them simultaneously. It is a constant, ongoing process. So then we start this first section, which John has introduced, understanding the three marks of existence. He says, the characteristics of samsaric existence uncovered through meditation practice are the three marks of existence. So John's asked me to provide a couple of definitions. It's hard putting the talks together because we cover such a broad spectrum of understanding. And that's great. And I've been very aware of that. And it took me a long time to write tonight's lecture, but you'll see as we go along what that is about. But specifically just now, John asked me to introduce two words, Dharma. So the way we're using it here with a capital D, we're talking about the teachings of the Buddha, such as the Four Noble Truths that John just mentioned, or the three marks of existence, which we'll be talking about here. That's primarily what this chapter is about. And the other thing that John asked about was samsara, right? So early on, experience is broken into two parts, the good and the bad, samsara and nirvana. If you want to use a Christian analogy, you could think of heaven and hell. It's really that simple. Sangha, right? The believers, the group of students, the group of practitioners. So we talked about the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And that's a really important concept throughout all of Buddhism. There's a lot here. I'll try not to gloss over any of it. And at the same time, I'll try not to get bogged down into any of the details. But I will tell you this personal story. 2 days into preparing this talk, rereading this chapter for the first time in a few years, I got to a point where it made so little sense. I thought to myself, I cannot teach this. Nobody can teach this. And I closed the book. And the next morning, I figured out a way to get into it. But that's sort of what it's like, not just with Chogyam Trungpa, but with all of it. But coming back here, so we're back to understanding the three marks of existence. The characteristics of samsaric existence uncovered through meditation practice are the three marks of existence. So sometimes they're just words and sentences, right? And we read them and what do they mean? What do they mean? What does this mean? It means this is what we begin to understand after we've been sitting for a while. You know, we sit for a while and then we begin to understand these things somehow. And that's what these three marks of existence are about. They're actually four. We've touched on the marks of existence in previous chapters where we have included the fourth one, nirvana or peace. Here we're considering just three, and these are impermanence, egolessness, and suffering. These are the things that rise to the surface as a result of practice, at least in the beginning. These things just sort of float up to the surface. You start to really wonder about these things: impermanence, egolessness, and suffering. The egolessness is a little misleading, but we'll clear that up later on. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche considers each of these in detail, examining how the recognition of impermanence leads to the experience of egolessness and how that combination produces suffering. This stepwise progression is the theme of this whole chapter. He says, understanding the nature of impermanence and egolessness and how that combination leads to suffering is a central part of the contemplative practice of the path of accumulation. This is really what this chapter is about. So for those of you who have been doing this for a while, there's this. And this is what I was alluding to a moment ago. But when we stop to consider this, a major contradiction immediately presents itself. Over the last 500 pages, we've been taught ego is the root cause of suffering. We've been taught that understanding ego's empty nature, understanding egolessness, is the cure of suffering. So, how can egolessness possibly lead to suffering? The way to understand this idea that egolessness could be a cause of suffering and not a cure for it is to remember that this chapter is from a contemplative, meditative point of view, not an intellectual, scholarly point of view. It is also the point of view of the rank beginner, a novice practitioner about to take the first step on the first part of the first path. We have to imagine we've learned nothing yet of the Four Noble Truths. That's the point of view here. And remember also how Judy Leaf constructed the profound treasury of the ocean of Dharma. These 3 volumes are an assembly of individual teachings given by Chogyam Trungpa at various seminaries over almost 20 years. It's not as if Rinpoche sat down with a pen in his hand and wrote out 1,500 pages of seamless composition from beginning to end. So there's that as well. It is true that letting go of ego in the beginning can be absolutely terrifying. Ego is, after all, what's gotten us through childhood. It's an amazing construction built by an infant. It's gotten us all the way to where we are today, for better or worse. Letting go of ego is the real meaning of renunciation. People think of renunciation as giving up fine clothes, good food, financial wealth, but it's not like that. It's much more profound. It's a fundamental shift in your relationship with the universe. And it can be absolutely horrible. It's also absolutely liberating, infinitely freeing, unimaginably empowering. But we don't appreciate any of that in the beginning. The first mark, impermanence. Chogyam Trungpa starts by talking about how the realization of impermanence usually begins with an appreciation of the possibility of loss of something valuable. We've talked about this. This is the suffering of change. The very best things that could possibly happen to us come with a seed of suffering already embedded within them. Why? Because everything changes. It's the nature of reality. Everything always changes. Rinpoche offers the possible loss of this precious opportunity to learn the Dharma as a perfect example. 2 approaches to impermanence are described. The simplistic approach, kusulu, refers to a yogi who does only 3 things: eats, defecates, and sleeps. A person satisfied with simple existence. This type of practice is called jagam, resting meditation. A second approach is more subtle, more metaphysical, more analytical, the style of the pundit. This distinction also nods toward the differences we'll encounter between the practice lineages and the study lineages. Between the Geluk lineage, for instance, His Holiness the Dalai Lama's lineage, and our lineage, the Kagyu lineage. Chogyam Trungpa goes on to say, once one begins to relate with impermanence at a crude level, impermanence begins to evolve until one feels one cannot hold on to anything anymore because things are constantly and fundamentally changing. There is no place for real rest or security. This shiftiness or slipperiness of psychological existence is a more fundamental level of impermanence. The 4 reminders that we chant before meditation every day are an example of this. Once one begins to realize that psychologically one cannot hold on to anything, seemingly solid phenomenal objects cease to be solid. In order to solidify an object, one's thoughts have to be solidified. One's being has to be solidified. But one cannot solidify one's basic existence in any way at all. There is nothing to hold on to. This experience could be called developing an empty heart. The whole thing is horrifically, frighteningly empty, and trying to hold on to any of it breeds further empty heart. There is a tremendous sense of groundlessness. Everything is moving so fast that nothing sticks, and there is nothing to hold on to. At this level, the experience of impermanence is so fundamental that it is almost mystical. The second mark of existence, egolessness. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche says, an understanding of impermanence is preparation for the experience of egolessness. As a practitioner, you have to develop a feeling for egolessness, as you did for impermanence. We do not approach ego philosophically. It is our immediate experience. Here, Chogyam Trungpa is not talking about ego from our intellectual understanding point of view. Again, he is talking about ego from the point of view of a rank beginner. He says ego is something whose purpose is to entertain us, to create the simple pleasure of occupying ourselves when we are bored or tired or unhappy. It is something which makes us relatively happy, something to keep us company. Misery loves company. The somebody who keeps company with our misery is our ego. Rinpoche says, however, having realized impermanence, the experience of no ground, we see that the idea of having somebody to keep company with our misery is a gigantic hoax. We are creating our own illusion. We begin to realize that there is no one to keep us company, and we have no hold on anything. Egolessness, from a contemplative point of view, is the alarm created by the experience of empty heart, the double take created from the realization of impermanence. When we discover egolessness, there's a faint sense of anger. It is so alarming, so bad. The discovery of egolessness is a further sense of lost. Rinpoche says, the experience of egolessness is very real. We could say that the experience of impermanence is one of discontinuity. And with the experience of egolessness, there's nothing to continue the discontinuity, since the moderator is also non-existent. This is an actual emotional experience very close to the heart and very desperate. We are constantly looking for confirmation, for a moderator to qualify our existence, but we discover none. That is the notion of egolessness here. Remember, that is the notion of egolessness in this context only. At the beginning of the lesser path of accumulation, we have the rank beginner's point of view, raw experience, without yet understanding that suffering is actually due to the grasping and fixation of ego, and without yet understanding that egolessness is actually our salvation from suffering. What Chogyam Trungpa is describing here are the very early experiences of impermanence, egolessness, and suffering, experiences that come before any real understanding of the Four Noble Truths, a kind of unmitigated terror. The third noble truth, suffering. For these same reasons, the first paragraph of the section on suffering on page 495 can be very confusing. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche says, the experience of impermanence and egolessness leads to suffering. He observes, the logic that says, because ego does not exist, therefore you should not suffer, does not work. And that is true at this point, but only because one has barely started along the path. As we've learned already, the correct view is this. Suffering does exist. That's the first noble truth. Ignorance is the root cause of suffering. That's the second noble truth, the grasping and fixation of ego. This has been taught to us from the very beginning. Judy Leaf, in her introduction, says, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche describes the truth of the origin of suffering in terms of ignorance. And this has been taught to us as recently as 2 chapters ago. In the 5 paths, Chogyam Trungpa says this: fundamental suffering is based on a basic karmic mishap arising from ignorance. You begin to wake up by means of meditation practice. You try to cut through twofold ego fixation, the ego of dharmas and the ego of self. So this sentence in front of us now, the logic that says, because ego does not exist, therefore you should suffer, does not work, only applies to this particular context, the level of the initial felt experience of a rank beginner. Finally, there's that confusing sentence at the bottom of page 495, which talks about the non-existence of ego as not being real. The non-existence of ego not being real. The double negative in that sentence has to be a proofreader's error. Probably what was meant there was, unlike the apparent existence of ego. This section is very easy to misunderstand. It's important to get it sorted out, and it helps to think of it in a sequential way. Anyhow, what Chogyam Trungpa is trying to get across here is simply the point that in the beginning, what we experience most of all, first of all, is impermanence, egolessness without really understanding it, and suffering. What page 495 boils down to is the First Noble Truth. Suffering is real. Chogyam Trungpa makes that point over and over. He says suffering is the only solid thing there is, otherwise we would not suffer. The idea of the path is that one doesn't fight back at the suffering, but one learns to make oneself at home with the suffering, because reality is suffering. It gets bleak. Chogyam Trungpa lists the different kinds of suffering and says as practitioners begin to discover that there is no permanent experience and no ego, they realize that the whole world is made only out of suffering. This is the definition of samsara, going around and around in the ocean of pain. He says transitoriness and egolessness bring more suffering, crystallizing the liveliness of the suffering and the energies around it. Finally, the chapter's tone changes. Chogyam Trungpa says, but then somehow or other, you begin to become involved in the realness of pain. That is how you begin to go on to the Four Noble Truths. Summarizing, he says, the experiential approach of the 3 marks of existence comes from the tradition of contemplative practice rather than the tradition of scholars. He talks a little about the intellectual schools and the contemplative schools. The Kaigyo and the Nyingma traditions are within the contemplative tradition. They use the layperson's approach to reality. He says, having developed a true understanding of the Four Noble Truths and the 3 marks of existence, a student may be inspired to renounce the samsaric world. He admits that there is some goal orientation on the path of accumulation. A goal exists and a journey exists. We choose nirvana as opposed to samsara. So this first path, the lesser path to accumulation, the entrance to the Hinayana, never really gets beyond the First Noble Truth, the truth of suffering. It's all about the accumulation of the experience of suffering, the appreciation and understanding of it. It's certainly not like the entrance to the Mahayana, the path of seeing, the very joyful Bhumi. This path is about the 3 marks of existence. Chogyam Trungpa once more. Understanding the nature of impermanence and egolessness and how that combination leads to suffering is a central part of the contemplative practice of the path of accumulation. And that's the engine that drives us forward, the lesser path of accumulation. It's pretty dire, frankly. So, on that note, I'll turn you over to John Tyler. But first, cheer up. cheer up. One of the things we've learned about emptiness is that everything is interrelated. The first Bhumi would not be very joyful if the lesser path of accumulation were not so awful. What we're broadly covering here is not just the first noble truth, but all four noble truths. They come as a complete package. Life can be awful indeed, but there's a reason for it, and a way out, and a path to follow. So cheer up, and good luck. Keep smiling. Thanks for your attention, and thanks for your practice. John Tyler.
Thanks, Philip. I'm going to cover the next chapter, chapter 64, which is the middle path of accumulation. And one of the early statements in the introduction, I think, is kind of telling. And it says as follows: an ordinary Hinayana practitioner on the path of accumulation is already on a journey toward the Mahayana. So it's a bit more optimistic. On this middle path, you are slowly, as a practitioner, moving away from the ordinary religious or spiritual practices. You're moving away from the idea of merely saving yourself or reaching a higher level and working to reach a higher level of spirituality. You're moving away from a notion of a savior, that is, someone who will save you in the long run. And in addition, you're moving away from you're moving away from the theistic nature of religions and the fact that they have no notion really of egolessness, which is a lot of what Philip was talking about. However, there's still a possibility that you could end up in the God realm by means of meditation. And in this sense, the saving grace is prajna, that is, seeing things as they are. And this is a theme that's reiterated, as you'll see as we go through the chapter. Vipassana allows you to sort what is ego-centered from what is not. That's an important statement. This is one of the outstanding qualities of Buddhism. It sows the seeds of intelligence in the student's mind so that they know how to separate the two approaches to the spiritual path. So the change from the lesser to the middle path of accumulation is that you cease to have an idea of a savior. At this point, you are finally becoming independent, he says, of theistic dogma. As a practitioner, you enter the second stage of the path when you have managed to cut the cause of being born in the lower realms. And those realms are, of course, the animal realm, the hungry ghost realm, and the hell realm. And I think the crux of this chapter is a mantra that's presented. It's called the mantra, or it's called the 16 incantations, or the mantra of experience. And this mantra, repeatedly, helps you to get closer to the truth of your conceptualization, of getting glimpses, and giving you some glimpses of clarity and sanity. You're not looking for a higher goal. You're simply manipulating your confusion in a wiser way. In that way, you begin to find yourself closer to freedom, he says. It is the repeating of the Four Noble Truths in four different ways. That's basically what the 16 incantations are, and we'll read those in a minute. This formula is said to cut the root of being born in the lower realms, or cutting of ego. So the first incantation says, suffering should be seen. The origin of suffering should be avoided. The goal should be attained. And the path should be actualized. And I think the first statement, or the second statement rather, the origin of suffering should be avoided, is really speaking to the move toward egolessness as you develop in your practice. The goal should be obtained, and that's obtained by awareness. And the path should be actualized, and that is done by practicing. The second incantation is suffering should be realized as impermanent. The origin of suffering should be realized as impermanent. The goal should be realized as impermanent, and the path should be realized as impermanent. In the third stanza, it says, suffering should be seen clearly. The origin of suffering should be seen clearly. The goal should be seen clearly, and the path should be seen clearly. And I think, in a sense, well, I'll hold that thought for a moment. The fourth incantation is no suffering, no origin of suffering, no goal, and no path. So the four sets of incantations are repeated 4 times in order for the individual to increase the sense of identification with the practice and the teaching. This is an important aspect of this middle phase of the stage, rather, of accumulation. So the first incantation speaks to the basic logic of the Four Noble Truths. It's a fairly clear statement of the Four Noble Truths. While the second incantation, we learn that the Four Noble Truths do not provide security because they are transitory experiences, as are all experiences. The third incantation asks that we develop some personal identification with these truths. They should be seen clearly and properly. And I think this goes back to an oft-used statement that, for us, and that is just see it. And the fourth set of points, the fourth incantation points out, in actual fact, the only requirement is to cut the karmic root of suffering, the origin of suffering, the goal, and the path. Therefore, there is no suffering, no origin of suffering, no goal, and no path. This is the final statement of the Vipassana experience. That we should cut the root of confusion altogether by clear seeing, by being in the present. And this is it's such an integral part of our daily practice of meditation. So we go on to talk about the importance of conviction, that is, belief in coming to feel strongly about these truths that we're learning, in particular through this incantation. The question then is, how is it possible, knowing the 4 ways of seeing the Four Noble Truths, to cut the cause and effects of being born in the lower samsaric realms? And he goes on to say, this happens because and when you have become completely and thoroughly identified with the teaching. This is also the reason that the 4 incantations are repeated 4 times. It is to build a real conviction. And there's a term that's used in conjunction with this conviction, which is Negpar Shepa, which refers to real conviction, knowing completely or thoroughly. And it says, he says, in addition, without pride in the teachings, you are unable to cut the karmic umbilical cord. So the idea of reciting the incantations is to build up your identification with the real teachings. And then the final section of this chapter deals with ethical guidelines. The middle level of the path of accumulation, he says, is ethically oriented with an emphasis on behaving properly in accordance with the practice. And he goes on to say, you exclude what is undesirable and include what is desirable in terms of the path. And you develop dhampa, or binding identity with the teachings. And you do this in addition to the intellectual aspect of learning the teachings. You do this in particular with your practice. He says, this is the definition of Shila, or morality, that's which binds you to the practice and the teachings. And he makes one point, and he says there's an issue with the ethical approach, and it's a tendency to feel guilty or to fear punishment. In this case, it is quite the opposite. The reason you keep your discipline is that you are inspired by your understanding of the 16 incantations of the Four Noble Truths. This realization brings you closer to the teachings. You have something, and you realize you have something to live for. And having identified with the teachings and been inspired by their implication, you begin to realize the virtues and faults of your behavior. Cutting the karmic knot of entering the lower realms is not dependent on behaving in a moralistic, ethical way or being good. You first need inspiration. You need to identify with the teaching. You need to feel you are a part of the lineage. So first you must have conviction, and from conviction and with tremendous faith and directness, you automatically behave in an ethical way. You pull he says in his inimitable fashion, you pull yourself together. So the ability to identify yourself with the teaching is a kind of heroism. It is how you bring yourself onto the path. And these are the qualities of the middle path of accumulation. Thank you very much.
I propose that we together chant these 16 lessons. Would that be okay with everybody?
Yeah.
So we could just, here, we could just do it like a chant. And I'll mute all and lead it. Anybody can do this, but I'll do it the first time. And we'll try this out. I've never done it, but this is what's meant to be done. So here we go. Everybody is muted. Yes. Okay. Suffering should be seen. The origin of suffering should be avoided. The goal should be attained. The path should be actualized. Suffering should be realized as impermanent. The origin of suffering should be realized as impermanent. The goal should be realized as impermanent. The path should be realized as impermanent. Suffering should be seen clearly. The origin of suffering should be seen clearly. The goal should be seen clearly. The path should be seen clearly. No suffering, no origin of suffering, no goal, no path. I don't know about you, I find that kind of powerful. So discussion. Anybody? I'll throw something out here. That the Pashana is key. And so to that end, let's everybody just take a good posture. It's not necessary to the practice of Vipassana, but it's like throwing a light switch. We could turn on Vipassana. So you take a posture and you bring your mind here into this present moment, clear, without thought, just aware of whatever happens to be arising and presenting itself effortlessly. This is Vipassana awareness, which he emphasizes throughout. And it cuts through everything. Cuts through belief in I. It cuts through suffering, because in order to suffer, you have to be thinking about how you don't like this and you would rather have that. It cuts through belief in impermanence, because there is no such thing as permanence. Everything is constantly flexing just here in the present moment. And there are the three marks. It cuts through this Vipassana being born in the lower realms. And what that means is the lower realms are the hell realm, which is the realm of hatred, the hungry ghost realm, which is the realm of feeling impoverished, and the animal realm, which is the realm of stupidity, just eating whatever comes in front of your nose, doing whatever without thought. Three lower realms, three worse realms. And how does it cut through them? By bringing you into intelligence, clarity, simplicity, here and now. So Vipassana is really the key. It contains shamatha, one-pointed focus on an object, because shamatha is what brings you back from dreams. But Vipassana means that having come back from dreams, dreams of the past and the future, dreams of what could have been, what shouldn't have been, what you hope will be, what you fear might be, all those dreams, you come back, that's shamatha. And then having come back, there's this clarity, awareness, which is natural to us. It's not something you build or develop. It's something that you just tune into. It's already there. Usually, we're lost in dreams, thoughts of regret, thoughts of hope, thoughts of fear, thoughts of all kinds, hatred, anger, poverty, thoughts of stupidity, wanting to just do it, dull yourself out. Those are the three lower realms. The upper realms aren't too much better, but slightly. We could go into them at another time. Should we do it one more time, the chant? Or should we just move on to discussion more? Tanya, you look like you had a thought.
I just also find the chant very powerful and just would like to read it or go over it a few more times on my own in the future, if not now.
Maybe we should do it in the mornings. What do you think? That would be different.
I can comment on a few things that I noticed after rereading this chapter quite a few times. Some of the things were that that kind of resonated with me was really connecting with the idea that when you appreciate a lot of things, your awareness of impermanence goes up. And I've really been feeling that a lot more, just really valuing every morning and every day. And it's almost like time slows down a little bit more with my students when I have special moments when I'm helping them. And then that experience of having no ground feeling that you can't hold on to anything or there's no place to sit. These things, the feeling of things being shifty and slippery, no place for rest or security. That part, when you add in no place for fear, becomes something very special in terms of the way that I'm perceiving things. Yes, so I feel less fear when I'm more present. I don't know if that makes sense to anyone, but I just really am enjoying that idea of losing the fear because that's not permanent either.
That's perfect.
Yeah, I'll say. The awareness of it is what's really hits me. Not so much losing the fears, but as being aware of it instead of trying to always run from it,
Mm.
seeing it in a rearview mirror. Yeah.
I agree. It's also cuts down on the fear because, like, most of fear is anticipating the future, right? So if we're present, that part of fear at least
Yeah.
is gone. Thank you.
If I could add something as well in terms of the fear, for me, it's in relation to the slipperiness and the non-identification with ego. It's not my fear. It's just the fear. There's fear. I experience this fear, but I don't own it, and it makes it less powerful and it dissipates more quickly. Thank you.
And I really like, Tanya, what your insight into impermanence, and the appreciation that comes from that. And so I touched on the four reminders. The second one is this. Second, the whole world and its inhabitants are impermanent. In particular, the life of beings is like a bubble. Death comes without warning. This body will be a corpse. We don't go through life like that. We think things will last forever. We carry grudges for decades. We don't appreciate a flower that's only going to last for an instant.
Sometimes we carry grudges for years,
Lifetimes.
lifetimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Regrets. That's a good one. There's something you can really torture yourself with for decades.
One of the nice things about the 16 incantations is that it is that movement as you move through the dharmas and as your understanding becomes greater and greater. The fourth one is after you've understood the Heart Sutra, which is all about emptiness.
Yeah, I like the progression. First, you just get them. Then you should see them as being impermanent. All of them. All four of the Four Noble Truths. And then you should see them clearly. That's the Vipassana. That's our practice. It's so simple, undogmatic. It's not philosophical. Just see things clearly without concepts and dogma and interpretations and all of that, regrets, and hopes, angers. Just see it clearly. And then the fourth one, what do you make of that?
Well,
No
after seeing clearly, you realize that nothing stands on solid legs, right? This anger that you think is so concrete, it's just a puff of smoke. Everything is like that, including the Four Noble Truths. You've moved from thinking that egolessness is a horrible thing to understanding that it is just a part of emptiness, that emptiness is the nature of reality, that that is what is the source of the beauty of the universe.
Yeah. Some of us here
Makes
are
me think
getting
of
old.
Henry David Thoreau a lot. We this makes me think of Thoreau a lot. We fritter away our lives. Um, so and Walden Pond, he was complaining about all of his peers who were just worried about the price of hay, um, as their lives were just, you know, sifting through their fingers. That's exactly what this is about. So we assign all of this concrete importance to stuff that has no concreteness to it at all.
So is there anything that is important?
Yes, the Buddhists teach that it comes down to, how do they phrase it? Um, non-conceptual compassion, that everything comes down to compassion without ego. And it does that automatically. You stay on the path, and that's where you eventually get to. But that's what reality is.
I differ. I think that the Buddhist teachings are teaching us that in the end, the only thing we can do is to enjoy and perceive accurately the constant, ever-changing nature of experience. That
Right.
it's constantly presenting itself in a new and different way all the time.
Yeah.
So in
But
the Tantras, they talk about dancing with it, play with it.
yes, they're the same thing. They're pure perception. The compassion just spontaneously arises from what you're describing.
The word compassion needs some definition. Compassion could be ruthless, could be fierce, as well as kind. Could be all kinds of things.
I think that's why they call it non-conceptual compassion. It's without grasping, without any sense of ourselves. It's a beautiful thing, with however you choose to describe it.
There's this
And
fellow on
beyond,
the wall
and
behind me
beyond,
here.
and beyond the Four Noble Truths. That's why I've lost the page, but there must be, no must be used 4 times in that last quatrain. It's
Anybody
such
else?
wonderful stuff.
It's interesting. Trungpa Rinpoche takes these beginning teachings, so-called, and makes them so profound. The highest teachings in the Nyingma sect are called the Dzogchen, Great Perfection Teachings. Ati in Sanskrit, Dzogchen in Tibetan. And there was a great teacher who, during his lifetime, was probably the most revered teacher in Tibet. His name was Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. He died, well, I think 1990. So he was around for quite a while. And he called what Trungpa Rinpoche taught the backwards path of Ati, meaning that he taught from the most beginning teachings with the profundity of the teachings of the end of the path. That's what Dilgo Khyentse said. He was one of Trungpa Rinpoche's teachers. I used to got a picture of him. Maybe next time I'll show you a picture of the two of them together in Tibet. Lulu Kensi was a very large man, very large. He was about 6'6", probably weighed, when I met him, must have weighed way over 200 pounds. Needed people up under his arms to have him walk around. When he blessed you, put his hand on your head like this, covered your entire head. But he was a great scholar and a great teacher. Other people, complaints, argument, agreements. I guess everyone's understanding is perfect.
Till next time.
So he, at the end, he says, so why does this formula, the Four Noble Truths 16 times, cut the root, the cause, the effect of being born in the lower samsaric realms? It's really being born in any samsaric realm. It's just that the lower ones are really nasty. Really nasty. I mean, you want to see somebody in the hell realm? I used to live down in the East Village in New York. And every once in a while, you'd see somebody walking down the street just screaming, talking to themselves, railing, just lost. I saw that on the subway too.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that? That's the hell realm. Lost. Miriam. Oh, Miriam, good.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you both, John and Philip, because I'm grateful to go through these initial stages again. And I was particularly relieved tonight to hear that the recognition of egolessness doesn't necessarily bring about the end of suffering. And this is something I've struggled with myself recently, since in the other class we're looking at emptiness and shunyata, and the fact that theoretically it should be related to a sense of liberation if you could really experience the truth of it. But it's difficult to apply, because my experience in any event is very much conditioned, and I'm still reacting the same way that I've always reacted to situations or contexts. I mean, now I don't take it as seriously, but tonight when we read that suffering is impermanent in the second stanza, I thought, wow, I wish I could remember that when I am in a place of suffering, because it would certainly take the edge off. And sometimes I get a glimpse of it, but it's good to know that there are stages to these insights, and that things get clearer with study and practice. So I'll leave it at that.
I'd like to respond by saying, my heart goes out to you. One of the things that struck me so much in preparing for tonight's class was how steep the initial learning curve is. I've totally forgotten that. For a long while, I've been thinking of emptiness and egolessness as my friend, as the only hope that there is. And yet here I'm getting it full in the face of what it's like for someone who's brand new to the teachings. It's terrifying. It's like the one thing that you could depend on that's gotten you this far. As bad as it is, at least it got you this far, right? And you're not dead. It's got to be worth something. And take that away, then what's left?
Yeah, it's very hard to have trust in your innate intelligence. There's often, I find, a concern still with appearing respectable, making a good impression. All of these things about self-presentation, especially if your job is in public speaking or teaching, or and it takes some trust in prajna, probably, to let all of those concerns go and realize that things work out really well when you can let go of the ego, when you're doing things where others are present as witnesses or judges even, right? Anyway.
So, yeah, you're exactly right. You live in a relative world, and a world of ultimate truth at the same time. So you're surrounded by people who are characterized by what? Their tendency to be judgmental. So it makes sense for you to pay attention to your appearance in body, speech, and mind, because you're surrounded by people who are going to just criticize you to death, given the slightest opportunity.
Thanks. It's good good to be reminded. But I still think it doesn't matter.
Not in the long run.
And the right intention takes care of body, speech, and mind, I think. But it's very hard to let go of that, wanting to look good, make a right impression. All of that is very difficult. Because I see it also as one root of suffering, right? If there is some judgment, then all of a sudden you failed. If you continue to evaluate yourself as you're going through that task, it's constant suffering.
And it's constant suffering for the person on the other side. Think of what it must be like going through life making judgments incessantly. That's no good. That's good. That's awful. That's nice. And then suddenly you're 72 years old. What happened to your life? You never stopped for a second to see what was around you.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think there's an element of serenity that comes out of these teachings, in the sense that you're more or less asked, in terms of staying in the present. You don't have to think about those things. You take your actions, and I think it was pointed out, I can't remember where the place was in this chapter 64, that once you get connected ethically, and you're on this middle path, that things do get a bit simpler, and the practice frees you to just be, without worrying about what you look like or how your speech sounds. I had throughout my life, I've always worried about my performance. And today I'm working with a little kid who's 7 or 8 years old. I'm with him 6 hours a day, every day. And I know nothing. I went in here knowing nothing. And what I realized was I just need to be tuned to him, and understand, and not try to have preconceived notions, and not to worry about my performance, whether it's at this level or it's at this level. Just do my best and it'll work. And that I only got from being part of this practice. I think, before that time, just as you said, Miriam, there was a constant concern with those kinds of issues, which are so useless. They're so meaningless at the end of the day.
Dan was pointing out years ago that sometimes all we can do is show up, and often that's enough. Like
Yep.
your 6-year-old, 7-year-old, how many people actually show up for him, really show up?
Yeah, it's the perspective. I mean, I don't know how, I'm not exactly sure how to say this, but the idea of practicing on the face of it is very simple. When you get into the intellectual concepts, and if you start twisting yourself around and around and around in terms of, I think I've heard John say, whether I'm a good Buddhist or not so good a Buddhist, it ruins the whole experience. The experience, you have to trust it. You have to put yourself into it and trust the experience, I think. And I think, being on this path with a bit of knowledge, I think that's enough. I think as you practice, the rest of it comes, and luckily we have this group of people we sit with every day and talk. We talk about these issues and one thing and another, and I think that's also very helpful. But I think one thing you can't do is over intellectualize it.
And yet, I find in my own mind, I have such powerful habits that just continue on by themselves. And often, like I took a nap this afternoon, and when I woke up, I realized I'd been having, a daymare, as it were, that my mind had just been spinning in something freaky. I couldn't even remember it. I can't remember it now, but I just remember this terrible feeling of groundlessness, of no place to put down roots. And these habits of mind, well, the teachings say, it's said right in this chapter, that if you practice vipassana, of coming back to awareness, you can burn out over time these habits. But I'll tell you, I've been doing it, 79 years now, and I've been at it since I was 24 or 5. It lasts. And I'm wondering when, if and when it will unwind and stop. And it's much less apparent in a situation like this one, where we're right here, we're clear, we're aware, we see the computer screen, we're talking to each other, we're listening. But when you cut off the stimulus to which you're being asked to respond, is when you go to sleep. Then stuff plays out. And what the teachings say is that when you die, and a lot of us are getting close to that, that when you die, it plays out, it's like a dream state, it can be. The different bardos, the different experiences, the death experiences, and you lose control. And in the last one, before rebirth, if you're going to take rebirth, if you're not getting enlightened in death, if you're going to take rebirth, they say it's like a dream, in that you see yourself as you were when you were 6 years old, for the first part of it, and for the second part of it, you see yourself as you imagine you might be in the future. And you're wandering through a world, and the world is changing so fast. One minute it's just one way, and another minute it's another, just like a dream. When you're dreaming at night, the dreams can change. One minute you're in Timbuktu, the next minute you're in Oshkosh. One minute you're furious, the next minute you're blissful. In the dreams, these mental states, when they're purely mental, they're not grounded with the physicality of the body. That's a great sanitizer, by the way. The body, it makes you sane. Not completely, not at all, but it's like it grounds you, brings you back out of dreams. But at night, there's nothing to ground you. Or, as they say, the teachings say, in death. And you can have, very difficult times. So I believe, I mean, I've come to trust in Vipassana, and yet it takes a lot of time and work for me. Each one of us is different, though, very different, depending on our previous karma and lives. Some people will get it fast. They talk about instant realizers. And other people take many lives and everything in between. But it does seem that Vipassana, that clarity, and all that it leads to is really the only way. So I'm sorry I went on. There was that dream this afternoon, waking up from that nap. Wow. I just felt so groundless.
John, isn't it true though that, given that we're in the practice, I have dreams like that. I can always tell. I told John earlier this week that I thought I lost all my tax information for this year, that I have to start all over again. And I dreamt about it, and it was terrifying. But when I woke up, I just said, you know what? It's just another one of those crazy experiences, and now I'm in a new reality. My eyes are open, I don't know. Somehow for me, there's a difference. Even though I still have all of those same kinds of things occurring, my reaction to them is very, very different since I've been practicing than it was before.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Because we understand them within the context of sanity, that we're experiencing more and more, the sanity of clear seeing, coming into that meditative state, if you want to even call it meditation. Meditation sounds like you're going somewhere where you're going to be less conscious. This is becoming completely, clearly conscious. So yeah, I agree.
Well, I'm confronted with this on an almost daily basis because my wife is a practicing Catholic, and she cannot understand how I don't get excited about certain things. She'll say, "Well, doesn't that really bother you?" And I said, "Well, will it make a difference if I say I'm bothered by it, or if I say I'm indifferent to it? I have things over which I have no control. I'm not gonna give any emotional energy to." It was never that way before. I could engage in a second, and I think it's the Vipassana, really, to be honest with you.
Where we're drawing towards the end, and there are people who haven't spoken, Kwan and Mel and who else? I think that's probably in Vicky. Kwan, yes, and then Mel.
I just appreciate all the discussion. These two chapters are not easy reading, so after the discussion, it's much more clear. So it's very helpful. So I just very appreciate it. All the sharings are very nice. So I'm enjoying and learning. So thank you all very much.
These chapters were sort of unusually difficult, I thought.
Yeah, it's a difficult reading. And the talk, some of the terms, just like the accumulation, the stage of different accumulation, it's I'm still not very clear why he chose those terms, because it's very different from other Buddhist teachings in describing those stages.
Mel, you had your hand up.
Well, very quickly, I want to say thank you and to John. I also woke up at 2:30 recently, a couple of days ago, and it was 2:30 in the morning. I couldn't go back to sleep, and it was out of anxiety about finding a way into this chapter that I had to teach tonight. Now, go ahead. We've been keeping you on hold here.
No, my thought is, how much less suffering would I have if I just didn't care what other people thought about everything all the time? Someone mentioned that earlier. I've thought about that quite a bit.
Thought about you or thought about life?
Yeah, in life, just how much easier would it be, or how much less suffering would there be if I just didn't care so much about what other people thought? How you present yourself, what you're wearing, type of car you're driving, how you look, how you don't look, how you speak, how you don't speak. If you're on time, if you're not on time, you know, what type of job you have, how much money you make, how educated you are, what you read, what you don't read. Are you into politics? You're not into politics. I mean, you know, whether your parents think, what's your family thinks, what's the neighbor think, what's your girlfriend, husband, well, whatever, what are they going to think? What are they going to say?
Hmm.
Is that ego?
That's it, Mel.
I think so.
That's it, man. That's the whole ball of wax.
Wow.
And this leads us to why this all leads to compassion, right?
Yeah.
We can't be compassionate if we're constantly involved in what we're going to get, what people are thinking, what we think of other people, right? There's no room for compassion there. So,
I, I just think that's why it feels so good to get on the Zoom and just sit, because within the group, everyone's sitting. Uh, there's zero judgment for, if you add it up, it's almost 2 hours a day of, virtually none of that type of suffering, at least.
Well said.
Well said, yeah. I was thinking as you spoke that, the word for the world of suffering is samsara, and in Tibetan it's korwa, and they both mean roughly the same thing, going in a circle. And there's a symbol um, for it in the Buddhist tradition, for samsara, for this suffering. It's of a snake biting its own tail and going around and around and around. Ah, yeah.
Sounds like a good note to close on.
Yeah, we should. Well, that's a great note to close on. I'm sorry. I should have. Okay. So we'll do the closing chant. I'll put it up. Who's leading? I don't know. Dan, do you want to lead? I can find it. Hold on a second. Anybody else have it to put up? And Barry?
we will close with a prayer for peace and then dedicating the merit generated by our practice and study to the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigden's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Nice
Thank you
evening.
so much.
See you.
See you
Have a
tomorrow.
good night.
Thank you.
So, good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
It's good to see you, Maria.
Right.
Good night, Maria.